Right after part one of Who Killed Joseph Smith came out, there was all sorts of people reaching out to me claiming that the door in the Carthage jail today is not the original door, but none of them ever had any evidence. They didn't stop there. They said that the stairs had been reconstructed, and one person even said the entire jail was new. None of it was original. And again, I was interested in their stories at first, but after a while, when I realized they have nothing to back up what they're saying, I just get annoyed because I know why they're doing it. And they're doing it again today because the church just made that purchase from the Community of Christ for the Kirtland Temple. And as a part of that, the people are saying that they bought the Carthage door. And that's their proof. That is not true. They just bought the Liberty Jail Door, not the Carthage Jail Door. I recently acquired a couple of photos from the early 1900s of inside of that jail, and I want to show you my evidence for why that jail door is the original. Okay, so you can see from this article from the Deseret News from the 6th of March earlier this year, they list everything that was included in that purchase from the Community of Christ. And under historical artifacts, you can see the portraits of Joseph and Emma. And under that is the original door of Liberty Jail. This is a picture of the Liberty Jail door. As soon as they purchased it, they put that in the Church History Museum, and you can go and look at that exhibit right now. This is a picture of the Carthage jail door. This is the exact same door that's in there today that's always been there since 1844. Compare those two side by side, you can see they're completely different doors. It is time to put this argument to rest. The door in Carthage is the original door. And like I said, I know why they're trying to say it's not. I know why the critics of the movie are saying that it's not. And it's because that door is an incredibly important piece of evidence that is helping us solve this case of figuring out who really killed Joseph Smith, what really happened in those 2 to 3 minutes inside the jail. In order to understand why the jail door is such an important piece of evidence in the martyrdom case, you first have to understand how the mainstream narrative has evolved over time. According to Willard Richards, all 4 men inside the jail were pushing the door closed to keep the mob from entering the room. The mob then fired a shot through the door just above the doorknob. Willard, Taylor, and Joseph, all 3 moved to the left of the door, and Hiram sprang 10 feet back, still facing the door. The mob then fired a second ball through the panel of the door, approximately 51.75 inches above the floor. That ball struck Hiram on the left of his nose. According to Willard, at that exact same time, a ball fired from outside of the jail came through the window and struck Hiram in his lower back. Hiram then supposedly fell on his back and never moved again. A third ball fired through the open door, grazed Hiram's chest, and struck him below his chin. A fourth ball fired through the open door, struck Hiram below his left knee, and a fifth ball also fired through the open door, struck him in his right hip. In the 1990s, the Lyon brothers analyzed the bullet hole in the door panel and discovered the bullet hole was pointing downward at a 5-degree angle, which means if Hiram was standing 10 feet back from the door, that shot would have struck him somewhere in his abdomen. This was a major new discovery, which proved a massive flaw in the Willard Richards narrative. The Lyon brothers then developed a new theory to explain their groundbreaking discovery. According to their theory, Hiram must have been leaning against the door when the mob fired their second shot through the panel. That ball entered Hiram's head to the left of his nose and exited below his chin. The LDS Church later adopted the Lyon brother theory and published it in their book, Saints Volume 1. Now, as I studied this theory, I realized it could not work because the ball that exited out of Hiram's chin would have struck him somewhere on his upper chest. But there were no other marks on his body that showed that to be the case. So I already knew that the Lyon brothers theory was problematic, but then I discovered on a copy of the death mask of Hiram that still preserves the wound below his chin, that wound is much smaller than the wound that's coming out of his nose, suggesting that was the entrance wound, and the wound coming out of the left of his nose was the exit wound. So now we have solid evidence that there is no way that shot coming through the door panel is the shot that struck Hiram in the head. It would have had to somehow hit him below his chin and exited out of his nose. And there is no way you can do that from a downward shot unless you had Hiram upside down. Can you see now why people are trying to say, well, that door isn't original? They will do anything to discount it as evidence because it completely obliterates the theory that the church has published. It is not the way that Hiram died. Okay, so it's super important to the case to prove whether or not that door in the jail today is original or not. What evidence do I have that it is original? So this is a picture of the door inside the jail today. That was taken in 2021 when I went there, first time I had ever been to Carthage. And the Lyon brothers, when they did their study and they figured out the angle of that bullet hole, they asked the same question: is this door the original door? And what they found in their study is that this door matches all 7 other interior doors in the building. They're all made of the same material and they were all handmade. That's why they were the first to conclude that this is the original door. I agree with that, but I don't think it's as strong as evidence as this photo that I recently acquired. And this was taken in the early 1900s by B.H. Roberts, church historian. He did a tour from Palmyra all the way to Salt Lake, and he was taking pictures of all of the historical church locations along the way, and he stopped at Carthage, and he snapped this photo of the Carthage jail, and at the time, it was used as a private residence. So I don't know who that is in the picture. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was the person that lived in the jail. But you can compare that with the door that's there today and see all of the similarities are there. The size, the shape, the patterns. You can see the 2 bullet holes. And what's interesting in this photo is that the hole in the panel, they filled that in with some kind of a putty. And you also see the evidence of the hole above the doorknob. What happened was, really quickly after Joseph and Hiram were martyred, a relic hunter came in and cut that piece of the door out where that bullet hole is. Whoever owned the jail afterwards put this block of wood in there to fill that in. So that was the door that we know as early as 1902, 1903, that's what the door looked like. It was still that original door. And it matches the door today. So both of those are good evidence that the jail door in the jail today is original, but they're not as strong as the third piece of evidence, which in the 1930s, Joseph and Eunice McCrae were called to be missionaries in the jail. And while they were there, they fixed a bunch of things up that had fallen into disrepair, and they documented and photographed everything that they did. And one of the first things they did is they located the person that had that the missing chunk of the door and convinced them to give it back, and they placed it back in the door. And this is a picture of that, and you can see it fit perfectly. If the door up to that time had been replaced or was a different door, I highly doubt that piece would fit perfectly in it and match the grain perfectly. So that's fantastic evidence from the 1930s at least that was the original door, because that piece had been missing for almost 100 years when they finally replaced it. So it was at least original in the 1930s. Okay, so now that the forensic evidence has proven that there's no way that shot through the door is what struck Hiram in the head, why does the historical record say that that's what happened? Well, we know exactly why Willard and John Taylor would say that that's what happened, is because they were kind of trying to cover their tracks. But there's other accounts. There's 9 other accounts of people mentioning that door and Hiram being shot. So we have to look at each of those accounts and figure out what did they say and how does that fit into the overall story. So the first 3 witnesses were not at the jail that day. So they must have heard the story from someone else and then they, retold it themselves. The first of those was Thomas Ford, who was the governor of Illinois. He had been in Carthage, But during the actual martyrdom, he had taken his troops and marched to Nauvoo. But he records in his 1847 biography what he believes happened. He says an attempt was made to break open the door, but Joe Smith, being armed with a 6-barreled pistol furnished by his friends, fired several times as the door was burst open and wounded 3 of the assailants. At the same time, several shots were fired into the room, by some of which John Taylor received 4 wounds and Hiram Smith was instantly killed. So this is a very interesting account. Whoever told this to him, it's a little bit different. He's saying that the mob burst the door open first, then Joseph started firing at them and they fired back, and it was those shots that struck John Taylor and Hiram. He doesn't say anything about that shot through the door. So he doesn't say it went through the door, but he wasn't there that day, so it's difficult to say how much value his account is. Okay, so the second mention is from John Hay. In his 1867, he wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly, and he was a resident of Carthage, but I can't tell from the record if he claims to have been there that day or not. But what he said is the mob fired at the door. Hiram Smith fell, exclaiming, "I'm a dead man." So he was not inside of the jail. So the fact that he said that Hiram said, "I'm a dead man," tells me someone's repeating this story to him as well. And the story is they shot through the door and that shot killed Hiram. So that's what he repeats in that article. There's not a lot of detail there to go off of, but I think it's pretty clear that he wasn't there himself witnessing that. He was just repeating the story he had heard. J.H. Sherman, in April of 1886, in the Ithaca Journal of New York, J.H. Sherman was also a resident of Carthage, and he could have been there that day, but he was a young boy at the time. And so he heard the story. He wrote about it in detail of what happened that day, and this is what he says. They tried in vain to burst in the door, for the Smiths and 2 bishops, all heavy men, bore against it from the other side. Then, turning the muzzles of their guns against the thin paneled door, several of them fired, killing Hiram and wounding Joseph and Bishop Taylor. So in his account, he talks about them pushing the door back and forth. The mob shoots through the door, and those shots kill Hiram and wound Joseph and John Taylor, which, how many times does he believe they shot through that door? That makes sense to me. Why would you try and break into the room if you could shoot through the door? If you know they're pushing on it from the other side and you want them dead, you would just shoot through the door and they're all dead. So he told the story in a way that makes sense, but, it's clear that he didn't see it for himself. He was repeating the story and adding his own details to it. So the next 3 witnesses that talk about something happening at that door, they were all there that day, but they were outside of the jail. They weren't inside of the jail witnessing it. They were outside. So the things that they saw on the outside, I tend to put a lot of weight on that, but the things that they saw that were happening on the inside of the jail, it's obvious that they would have heard that story from somebody else. The first of those is William Daniels, and he wrote a pamphlet, or he dictated the information, and another guy wrote the pamphlet all about what happened at Carthage. And this was from May of 1845, and he just admits right up front, to give a relation of some of the particular circumstances that transpired in the jail, I am compelled to depend principally on the statements of others. That's right. Those statements that he says about what happened on the inside of the jail match John Taylor and Willard Richards' statements, because later he became a member of the church, and he wrote that pamphlet because he was kind of famous for being there that day, and everyone wanted to hear him tell the story. So it's clear that he spoke with John Taylor and Willard when he was recounting what he believed happened on the inside of the jail. He says, my sources of information upon these points, however, are of such a nature that the reader can regard them as strictly correct. Well, if he's quoting Willard Richards, then we know they are not correct because they don't match the forensic evidence. Hiram stood near the center of the room in front of the door. The mob fired a ball through the panel of the door, which entered Hiram's head at the left side of his nose. That detail for sure tells me he gets it from Willard. That's exactly how Willard describes that it happened. So, yes, it is in the historical account. Another eyewitness that was there that day saying that Joseph was shot through the panel, but he didn't see it himself. He was just telling the story that he heard from Willard. Next is Thomas Barnes. And Thomas Barnes is the doctor that acted as a coroner, and he's the one that actually removed the ball from John Taylor's hand. He was on the scene inside of the jail right after the martyrdom, but he wasn't in the jail when it actually took place. In November of 1897, he wrote a letter to his daughter, which explained and gave us some excellent detail about what happened, what he saw that day. And he said, "It appears that one of the balls in the commencement of the attack passed through a panel of the door and hit Hiram in his neck, which probably broke his neck. He fell back and died, as I was informed instantly." So again, he was in the room. He could have looked and seen the hole in the panel of the door, and he could have looked, and he did look, and see the wounds on Hiram and tried to explain those, but he had to use the story that was told him, obviously by Willard Richards. And it's interesting because this is the guy that in his account said that Willard Richards was hiding behind the door when it was opened for the entire event, and that's why he was never hurt. But later that night, Willard wrote in his journal that he was to the left of the door. So Thomas says Willard told him he was hiding in the corner behind the door, but his journal doesn't say that. That's why I always feel like Willard realized, oh, that sounds like a cowardly thing that I told him I was hiding in the corner. So let's say I was on the left, knocking down muskets with my stick. Anyway, Thomas, again, he saw the wounds on Hiram's head. He's the one that points out that that shot hit Hiram in the neck or below his chin, and that probably he's the one that theorizes that probably broke his neck. So that's super interesting. That's in the historical account, something that is basically evidence that that shot came from under the chin. There's other evidence in the historical account that that shot came from under the chin, but this is Thomas Barnes's version. So the third eyewitness that was there that day is William R. Hamilton, the son of the man that owned the hotel in town. Went up into the jail immediately after it happened and had a look around. Here's the story he tells. When the mob started upstairs, those in the room shut the door and attempted to hold it. After those in the hall had tried several times to push it open, Smith having shot at them by putting the muzzle of his old English pepperbox revolver through the opening at the side of the door made by their efforts, and firing 4 shots into the hall, one of the men placed the muzzle of his rifle against the door and fired, which shot killed Hiram Smith, he being behind the panel in a position to do most of the work in keeping the door shut. So this is a very interesting account. Again, it's pretty old. He didn't see it for himself. He was clearly retelling the story, but he saw details in the room that he could try to make the story fit. And what he heard, or the story he heard, or the way he explained it at this time, was that Joseph Smith was the first one to stick his gun through the door and fire at the mob. That's when they fired back through the panel, and that shot is what struck Hiram. But they're saying that he's saying that Hiram was against the door at that time. So again, Willard and John both say he was 10 feet back. That was the second shot fired by the mob before the door was opened that struck him. And now William Hamilton is saying, no, the door had already been opened. Joseph had already fired through it. Then they shot, and Hiram was still standing close to the door. Okay, so far out of the 9 witnesses, the additional witnesses to Willard and John Taylor, 3 of them weren't even there that day. 3 of them were there that day, but they weren't inside of the jail. So all of these guys told the story a little bit differently with different details based on whoever had told them. So the final 3 witnesses were all members of the mob who were inside of the jail, up the stairs, outside of the room when the martyrdom happened. So these are the ones I study the most closely to figure out what details they can share about this event. Okay, the first of those witnesses was Jeremiah Wiley, and he wrote a statement on the 13th of August, 1844. Jeremiah was actually a member of the church, and he spoke with a fellow by the name of Henry Matthias. And Henry Matthias was in Warsaw when the martyrdom was happening, and he drove a wagon towards Carthage and picked up some of the men, supposedly some of the mob members that were involved in the martyrdom, and heard them talking about it. And Henry Matthias related those details to Jeremiah Wiley, and now we have that account today. So it's pretty close after the martyrdom happened, but it's going through a couple of different people, so we'll see what we can learn from these details. These three said that they were the first at the prison door, and they could not open the door. That is such a common thing. They get to the door, it's stuck. They can't get it open. That's in enough of these accounts that I'm like, okay, that was probably the case. So that door was stuck. One of the three then shot through the door. They then burst the door open when they received these wounds from Joe's pistol, and Joe then went to the window. So this is a super interesting account because they talk about the door being stuck and one of them shooting through the door, but they don't mention anything about it striking Hiram. What they say is as soon as the door opened, Joseph started firing back at them. And then clearly one of these three guys runs back down the stairs. One of them stays there in the gunfight with Joseph and shoots at him while he's running towards the window, is what he says. And then the other guy that had run outside shot him from the ground up through the window. So it's a great account. There's much detail here, but it says nothing about Hiram being shot through the panel of that door, even though they do say they shot through that door. So that's super interesting. The next account is from William Webb, given on the 14th of October, 1844. And this was actually a letter that was written into the editor of the paper, and this guy hated Thomas Sharp, and Thomas Sharp was running for some sort of political office, and he was like, you do not want to vote this guy in, so he wrote this editorial. And he explained that he was there at Carthage, and he was made to go up into that room and kill the Smiths. And this editorial was not published in the paper at that time, but it was kept in the office, and somebody later got a hold of it. And so now we have it, and it offers some more interesting details. It says, we then marched to the jail, overrun the guard, and rushed in the jail. The door of the room was closed by the Smiths so hard that we could not enter. Yeah, I've heard enough people say that I think that that's an accurate detail. The mob went up the stairs, and there at the door it was shut tight and they couldn't enter. One of our men shot through the door, and he says, and a man fell back on the floor, I supposed dead, as he never made any attempt to rise. So that is evidence that was Hiram. He doesn't say it was Hiram, but he says he shot through the door and a man fell back on the floor dead. The door flew open. I saw two men in the room. We shot at them several times. At length, one of them fell on the floor. The other jumped out of the window. I ran down the stairs to see where he was. When I got to him, he was trying to get up. He appeared stunned by the fall. I struck him in the face and said, "Oh, old Joe, damn you, where are you now?" I then set him up against the well curb and went away from him. So this sounds an awful lot like the guy in the version from Jeremiah Wiley, who they got in a gunfight, and then he ran down the stairs. And suppose the other account says he shot Joseph through the window. This one, he doesn't say that. This account, he doesn't even talk about the gunfight. He doesn't mention anything about the door flying open and Joseph firing back at them. So I'm like, where did he get this detail? A man fell back on the floor, I suppose dead, as he never made any attempt to rise. Now, when he shot through the door, how would he have seen that? Because the door was closed when he shot. And so that's my first question. My second question is, there's no way that shot through the door hit Hiram, if that's who he's talking about, in the head and killed him. That didn't happen. The forensic evidence has proved time and time again that that is not possible. So how did he add this into his account? I can only assume that he heard somebody talking and telling this story after the fact, and he combined it into the things that he actually witnessed. And again, he didn't talk about Joseph firing at him or wounding him. And he says, William Webb is my real name, because in the other account, he's given a different name. So this is a super curious account that we have to keep an eye on in the whole story. The third account was given by James Belton. And James Belton was there that day, and he was one of the mob members that actually went inside of the jail. And he left Carthage very quickly after that and lived his life in North Carolina, I believe it was. And towards the end of the 1800s and the 1890s, he was about to die. He was really sick. And he called his priest over and he said, I want to confess. And he confessed to that priest that he was a part of the martyrdom. And that priest held it, kept that secret for another 30 years or so. And finally, they published it in the newspaper, in the Mount Airy News, and give us the details of James Belton. And Belton said that he and 3 companions broke into the Carthage jail and planned to murder Smith in his cell, but somehow the man escaped by jumping through the window. So not a lot of detail there at all. Nothing about shooting through the door or the door being struck or anything about Hiram or any of the other guys in the room. It simply says, 4 of us, we were in the jail, tried to get Smith, he escaped by jumping out of the window. So what does all of this mean? These are the 9 eyewitness accounts other than Taylor and Richards that have anything to do with the door and somebody firing through the door. I think they're all valuable. I think we can learn something from all of them, but I give different weight to the different sources, especially if they weren't there that day at all. Obviously, they're just telling the story that someone else had heard. And by this time, Willard would have published it in multiple newspapers. So everyone could have seen that story and told that story. I find the accounts from the people who were there that day to hold more weight, because especially the ones that went inside of the jail, like the doctor and like Hamilton, because they could look around and see the evidence and match that to the story. And after they looked at the evidence, they didn't match Willard's story. They sort of told Willard's story, but they told their own story because Willard's story doesn't make sense. But the final 3 witnesses were actually mob members that were in the jail that day. And it's super curious that the most detailed of all of those in the Jeremiah Wiley account doesn't talk anything about killing Hiram or that shot through the panel of the door striking Hiram. But the second one, the William Webb one, doesn't mention Hiram by name, but says something which they didn't see. So to me, it looks like they inserted that detail after the fact, but I don't know. This is the eyewitness accounts that we have. And the main thing that I want to go through all of these and all of this detail today is so that you understand that door that is in the jail is the original door. And it is an important piece of evidence. And it proves that that shot that came through the panel did not strike Hiram in the head. So I know that my critics are going to go to the William Webb testimonial and say, well, yeah, but this guy that was there that day says that's what happened. And I'm like, well, what are you going to believe? The forensic evidence, or are you going to believe the eyewitness testimony? And of course they believe the eyewitness testimony of Willard Richards and John Taylor. But I'm telling you, this has been my approach from the beginning, is the forensic evidence trumps the eyewitness account. It always does in court today, because people can lie, people can forget, people can embellish, but the actual physical evidence does not lie. That is the original door. It is pointing downwards. We have the death mask that shows the entry wound on Hiram's head came from under his chin. You add that all up, it is impossible that that shot struck Hiram under the chin. Unless he was somehow upside down, there is no way to make that shot. So knowing that about the forensic evidence, I can look at the eyewitness accounts and try to piece together what happened. And when I get to the William Webb account, yeah, I agree. It looks like this is an eyewitness saying that they shot him through the door, but I know that was impossible. So that's how I continue to attempt to analyze that account. And I'm going to go through it further in the next part, because today we're talking about the door. Next time I'm going to talk about the stairs and why the stairs are such an important piece of evidence in this whole thing. And it seems crazy that I'm making a whole video about this, and I get that. And people ask, why do you spend so much time on this? And today is the anniversary of the martyrdom. You know, it's been 180 years since this happened. And here I am dredging up all of this stuff from the past, trying to figure out what happened. And people want to know why. And the reason is because it's not to avenge Joseph and Hiram's deaths. I'm not trying to do that. You know, I think that they were great prophets and great men, and the message that they shared about the gospel was a true message. But I'm not trying to avenge them. I'm not trying to convince you through this examination of the evidence that they were real prophets. What I am trying to do is uncover what really happened, because I believe it was a conspiracy. I believe it was an inside job. And if that's true, then this is a secret that's hidden, and it's been hidden for 180 years, and it's time for it to come to the light. Because there's a lot of people that believe this narrative about the martyrdom that is simply not true. And that is causing them to be on a path that is built on something that is not true. That's what I want to do. I want to get at the truth. I want to break down any false traditions so that people can understand the truth about what Joseph taught, about what's really in the gospel. Let go of any false traditions and get to the truth. Appreciate you guys taking this time to watch with me today, and hope you all take the time to remember the martyrdom and how important of an event that was in the history of all people who came from a Mormon or a Restoration church, but really to the whole country of America and to the world. This is an important piece of history. This is one of the most important cold cases to figure out. So thanks for being here with me.